welcome back to episode 6 of Resilient State, with me, Honey Louise. We've had to switch up our posting schedule, so this week, which was meant to look at the Munich Security Conference, we've decided to postpone until after the Munich Security Conference. Instead, this week, we'll be talking about astropolitics. Now, just before we dive into that, I'd like to thank last week's guest, David Kirichenko, for talking with us about the rise of the UAV. It was a conversation about a development in warfare that's tangible, it sits in our hands, and news on drones and the rise of the UAV covers our news feeds. That's why it's really interesting to dive into our topic this week, where we look to the fact that not everything that shapes national security is visible. Some of the most important parts of modern security sit far above us, far even above drones and above fighter jets, to be completely out of sight in our everyday lives. The space domain isn't just about rockets or sci-fi weapons. It underpins almost everything that keeps modern society running, from banking systems to GPS to communications to weather forecasting to military coordination and the basic digital infrastructure we rely on every day. If something goes wrong up in the space domain, the consequences are felt immediately down here on Earth. In this episode of Resilient State, we're talking about space as a domain of national security. And to unpack that, we're joined by Bleddyn Bowen, one of the UK's leading voices on space security and astropolitics. We'll start by discussing why space is an important domain for both military operations and civilian life. We'll then move on to talk about what is currently happening in orbit, and then link this together to see why what is happening in space matters to us down here, and how it connects back to our everyday lives. After that, we'll move on to a more positive track, and talk about how we can secure space security, and what's being done to make the domain so far above our heads safer. So, to start off with, I just wondered whether you could briefly introduce yourself. Usually I do the introduction, but I thought this time it might be interesting to have you introduce yourself and your career and what your experience within the space domain is, and especially astropolitics.
I started studying international politics as an undergraduate at the Department of International Politics at Aberystwyth University in Wales. And I got into strategic studies or war studies as an undergrad, and looking at contemporary warfare, I couldn't ignore the role of space systems, whilst seemingly many other people could. So looking at the role of satellites in the US way of war, US military technology systems, and I realized that you could actually talk about space without sounding like a silly person, going on about the moon all the time or sci-fi, really, but talking about...
Yes, bit Star Wars.
Yeah, real things that actually mattered in meaningful ways. So the satellites in space that provide these really important military and civil services to everyone. So that's what really got me into it. And I'd had a long interest in most things about space, since I was a kid. So to realize then I can actually do what's becoming like my academic interest in politics and international relations and warfare with a space dimension then pushed me down that route. And I was lucky to get the ESRC funded PhD position also at Aberystwyth to do my PhD on military thinking and outer space. And then after that, I was lucky to get full-time employment pretty quickly after the PhD in academia, so I never had to leave it. So that in a nutshell, really. And so it's 10 years almost to the day since I got my PhD. So I've been doing military space stuff. Thanks. I've been doing military space stuff for quite some time now.
So then why does space matter both in terms of the military domain and the civilian domain? What goes on up there that affects our life down here, and why do we need to care about it as a domain?
Yes, so right now, there are about 13,000, 14,000 active satellites in space, and these are owned by 90 plus countries or companies registered within those countries or states. And, these provide really important services such as communications, position, navigation, and timing services, Earth observation or imagery, or spy satellites or reconnaissance, and like missile early warning, and also weather satellites as well, just to name a few, really. And a lot of these systems are first developed. Excuse me.
No,
a lot of these systems were developed for military purposes, but in the last 40 years, they've really come to influence and structure our civilian, technological lives as well. So when you use GPS, you're using it to get your precision pizza delivered to you. it's also giving precision bombing capabilities to US and NATO forces as well. It's the same technology behind. Or another example is, precision dating. Good luck using Tinder or Grindr without GPS. It's the same technology.
So if space is this incredibly important domain which touches on our civilian lives and our military lives, and as you mentioned just with GPS, can affect us in so many different ways, why do you think we have such a fictional understanding of space first, and then it's through that fictional understanding we come to see the importance of space as a domain?
Yes, so a lot of awareness about outer space has been shaped or perhaps held back, really, because a lot of governments for most of the space age have downplayed or hidden military and intelligence space activities, and a lot of the work was classified as well. So there were good reasons to keep them hidden as well. So you didn't want to tip off say your Cold War adversaries exactly how good your spy satellites were and what you were finding out about the other side. But also many governments were happy to let, I'd say the US, for example, with NASA, to take all the attention and become the image of the United States in space, because it's all nice about, the courage of the human spirits and the innate desire to explore and all that turgid, cliched language that we have with outer space, really. And that becomes a more positive, inspirational thing. And you look at the language about the Hubble Space Telescope and the images around it, and then you have these popular science personalities trying to sound profound about everything,
like soft power. There's a lot of
and and it worked, because I mean, even I've got a NASA t-shirt. Everybody wears a NASA t-shirt. You don't see people wearing, I don't know, State Department t-shirts or US Treasury t-shirts.
We could start a new trend.
Yeah. But NASA's a federal agency, but that's the power of the imagery of space science, and genuinely impressive things that they've done for space science and education and our understanding of the universe around us. So it's not to take away from it. So I'm not saying you can't enjoy that. And it's quite nice. I like looking at those things myself, like the James Webb Space Telescope stuff now. But it was a useful smokescreen all the same for what the bulk of the space industries around the world were doing, which was providing services for governments, military as well as civil. So you had telecoms for the military as well as commercial telecoms around the world. You had imagery for spy satellites, but as well as for mapping agencies around the world as well. So there's been a lot of the military side of space has been sort of toned down in the public domain, only until about the last 10 years, I think. Especially in Europe, a lot of European governments are talking about these things more frankly and openly now. We see that with NATO's space policy from 2019. We see that with, Britain's national space security policies from the mid-2010s and like the defense space strategy now. The US Space Force being set up in 2019, which basically rebadged what the US Air Force was already doing in space. And that was a more of a bureaucratic and military cultural exercise and acquisitions change rather than doing anything fundamentally new in space in the Pentagon, really. So, yeah, there's a lot of ground people have to catch up on in terms of understanding, how so much of the space age is a military one. The history of space is very much a military history.
Turning towards the orbit, what are the key developments or the trends that we should be paying attention to? I think both in terms of what states are doing, but also in terms of, let's say, what individuals are doing. People like Elon Musk, how are they also impacting what's happening up in space?
Yeah, there are only a few trends really that are sort of stuff that we'll probably end up still talking about in the years to come, and that is just growth, the number of platforms, so the number of satellites in space. So when I started my PhD in 2012, we had about 1,200 active satellites in space. We're now looking at over 14,000 satellites in space. And at the moment, about 9,000 of those are just Starlink satellites, but they just provide one type of service. but that still leaves many other thousands of satellites still owned by either 90 plus countries or companies registered within those countries. So you're looking at a very diverse political system out there, but most of those satellites are still basically owned or registered to a handful of political authorities in terms of any significant numbers. The lion's share will be taken up by, of course, the United States, Europe collectively. So that would be the European Union, European Space Agency, their member states. ESA and EU are not the same thing, but overlap. Russia, China, India, Japan, and then you have South Korea, Taiwan, Turkey, Brazil. After them, that's the lion's share really already taken care of in terms of countries with a bulk of satellites in space. But countries like China, the United States, and Europe then are looking at putting up mega constellations. So we've already had that with the SpaceX and Starlink, the 8,000 small communication satellites. Looking at Europe now with the OneWeb system, which is, I think now is mostly a French thing, looking at how it's being organized, and that's about a constellation of about 750 satellites. Europe is also going to be putting up a lot more satellites as part of the wider communication system. China is also starting to put its own mega constellations up as well. So I think there's a few hundred already, and that will be several thousand a couple of years, and there'll be many more to come again. So you're looking at many tens of thousands more of satellites being put into space. That just means far more traffic and a lot more need for coordination, traffic monitoring, satellite monitoring, just knowing who's going where in space. And if you can figure out better information on where everything exactly is, you can maybe start looking at traffic management, traffic coordination. I don't think the politics is there for traffic control yet on a global level. The needs for that are only going to increase. That's one big trend. The second one is that America's allies, still allies at the moment, are basically looking to build their own communications and intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance capabilities independent of the United States. You're looking at Japan, South Korea, Taiwan, and European countries and Canada. They all rely on American space systems for their high-tech weapon systems to work. For example, look at the British Storm Shadow missile. It's a very good missile, particularly when it knows where to be aimed at. And that targeting information comes mostly from the Americans, as far as we know. So if there's a problem with the United States in supplying intelligence from space, which they withdrew for the Ukrainians at one moment in 2025, which terrified Europeans and America's other allies, the weapons become quite useless. You just got very expensive duds. So that's why now we have Japan, South Korea, Taiwan, and Europe specifically putting billions now into developing their own military space systems on top of what they already have, but at a scale that we haven't really seen before. Notably in Europe, we have Germany now spending 35 billion euros over the next 5 years to basically start on its own sort of new military space infrastructure program, and they're focusing on radar satellites first, if I understand correctly. And that'll be contracted by a Finnish company called ISI.
Oh.
Those are the two big trends focusing on at the moment.
Now, do you think the public have any real sense on how, should we say, fragile the space environment is right now? What's going on, and actually what all that signaling means, and how much money is being sent up there?
Yeah, so there's one point about the space economy, I think, that's often lost commentary, journalism in particular, but also in research as well. And that is on hype around a commercial space age and the obsession a lot of news coverage has over space billionaires, in particular Elon Musk, Jeff Bezos. The reality is that the global space economy still relies on public spending. So SpaceX and Blue Origin are chasing government contracts. They're not spending those billions because they're obsessed with space in terms of they want to spend all their money on it no matter what. No, it's a business model. It's a business. And the US government is the single biggest customer. That's still in the US space economy, which has the largest private presence in terms of the space economy as well. When you look at other countries around the world, the government is an even more powerful actor and client for private companies wanting to fulfill contracts and services for the state buyers. So I'm not aware of a single space company really that would survive without the government as a customer or a funder, provider of other infrastructure at some point, chains. Because with a lot of space companies and services, it might be another company that buys a lot of services, but they're often in the military industrial complex, which themselves get huge government grants or contracts. That's not a criticism necessarily. That's a different discussion. People are confusing commercial ownership with commercial demand for things, when a lot of it is still driven by government or public institutions as consumers of space services for public services, really. And that's a topic of a research paper I'm hoping to get published sometime this year, actually. That's sort of a point on space economy that needs to be spelled out. And then in terms of environment sustainability, and this being an important part of our work at Spark at Durham, yeah, it's a lot of the challenges that we understand the big concepts around it, but a lot of the detail is really difficult to get a handle on. That's both on the scientific side, but also on the policy side as well. So on the scientific side, there is still debate as to, for example, what is the carrying capacity of low Earth orbit? How many satellites can you really put there before you run out of literal space? Close can you really fly these many satellites? So if you've seen these diagrams, and this is a point one of my PhD students made, if you can see those diagrams of the clutter around Earth orbit and you just see lots of dots, those dots are huge, right? They're not to scale. So it looks immensely cluttered, and it is, but there's so much space in between all that stuff as well. And the scientific modeling is not unanimous in terms of the risks and probabilities of being hit by stuff. Like, we know things are getting worse because we are putting more junk up there, but as to how cute it is or whether we're on a threshold point, the specifics of the Kessler syndrome are still being debated by scientific community. I'm not saying I don't want to be alarmist, but I don't want to be complacent, but there's still a lot of work that needs to be doing on understanding first what we don't know and understand. So we know making the problem worse, though. So that big concept is understood. And even with Kessler's original research in the 1970s, the mathematics from that, and this was a paper I wrote in 2014, and the mathematics from what I saw back in 2014 said, even if we stopped launching new stuff in 2014, there was enough junk in Earth orbit to eventually have a runaway growth in the debris population, in the numbers of pieces of junk in space. And that was back when we had like 1,500 satellites in Earth orbit. So we definitely made the problem worse, but the exact details need to be figured out. And then on the policy side, it's a real challenge then, because you have to be true to what our empirical knowledge has to say. Because if you do monger for many years and nothing bad really happens, then people ignore you. Then the problem is the boy who cried wolf kind of syndrome. But then you don't want to say, oh, we're not sure about this. Politicians will see that as, well, we don't need to do anything then because you don't know. So we're not going to stake our budgets and reputations based on a maybe from the experts. So it's about getting these communities to talk to each other is a real challenge, and getting the basics right in terms of people like me talking to the scientists saying, I can be a sympathetic here in understanding the science, but then I can say, yeah, but when you talk to practitioners, you need to have sort of confident answers about how serious and acute a problem this is. So there's a lot of work that needs to be doing on both the sciences and the humanities, social sciences sides to really get our head around debris, because any action has to happen on a global level, because it's really expensive to do anything about debris. And I can't see China or America starting to spend billions out of the goodness of their own hearts to try and clean up the mess that they own in space.
Building on what you mentioned there about this runaway growth in debris and about just how many satellites there are and how they can all be up there without any crashes, without them colliding with each other. What would be the ways, if I'm just going about my day, driving to work, and two satellites were to collide, or many satellites were to collide, how's that going to impact me? What's that going to look like?
Well, I'm going to give you a boring academic answer, which is it depends. So with all these satellites and these different classes of satellite services, so navigation, communications, observation or surveillance, those things, our timing is important as well. All those things provide different kinds of services to different kinds of parts of the state and society and economy. And where an event happens then matters because different satellites are flying around in different parts of Earth orbit as well. So a debris event in low Earth orbit, where most of them have happened, is less an acute of a disaster than if a proper breakup or like a random explosion of a satellite happened in the geostationary belt. So let's take low Earth orbit. We're looking at a range between 200 kilometers altitude to 2,000 kilometers altitude. So that's a lot of altitude there already. So there's a lot of vertical volume to work with. But then it's all around the planet. Satellites will be orbiting in every kind of orbit within those altitudes. So north, south, east, west, west, east, south, north, and at different angles, at different altitudes. So it's really busy, but they are very widely dispersed. They can congregate sometimes around the poles. That can be quite a heavy bit of traffic, but very dispersed. And then certain altitudes are busier than others within low Earth orbit. So wherever Starlink is now, I think it's maybe 700 kilometers altitude or something, 800. Something happens there, Starlink's going to have a very bad day because most of the satellites are in roughly the same altitudes. The space station, the International Space Station and the Chinese space stations are lower, like 400 kilometers. I can't remember these figures, but they're a bit lower. Now, debris can go in different altitudes, but not the main body, on usual kind of projections. So it's much more of just a random shooting gallery. Now, if something happens in the geostationary belt, and this is about 36,000 kilometers above the equator, so it's a thin belt directly above the equator. They're not all around the planet. They are literally at 0 degrees, and then take a line from there out from the equator to 36,000 kilometers. And that's where a lot of crucial military command and control satellites are. And that is also where a lot of really important weather satellites are. And they're all in a belt, sort of next to each other. And if one of them like blows up for whatever reason, say like a fuel tank just goes off, and that could be from a dead satellite that hasn't been decommissioned properly, it would create like a ball of debris that would easily then start knocking into all the other satellites in that belt after it. Depending how that's like a worst case scenario. And it's not going to hit everyone, but I don't like those odds.
I suppose just to jump in, we're talking about debris, and you mentioned a fuel cell if it was to just go off. But what is the risk that we see to people from hostile actions in space? From I'm an aggressive state, you're the state I'm being aggressive to, so I choose to take out your satellites. And I'm not just talking about I take out, say, a military satellite in this geostationary belt, but if I really want to create an awful day for your civilians, have we not put massive amounts of risk and really exposed ourselves?
Well, I mean, if you're a state actor and you don't care, I mean, if I was North Korea, if I was a military planner, I would definitely be planning to detonate my nukes in space. That would be a very, very bad day for South Korea, Japan, and the United States, also China, and most of the people around the world. But if it means then that your regime survives, then that would be, for them, war-winning calculation, possibly for the North Koreans. So you don't have to reach for the non-state actors, really. If you want to really take out the US military machine, damaging or disrupting GPS is the big concern for US military planners. But because the GPS is now so useful for the civil and military infrastructure, that's what's happened through, let's say, a particularly successful cyber attack or a large-scale missile strike against the 30 or so GPS satellites the Americans have in medium Earth orbit. Then, yeah, we huge infrastructural problems around the world. Now, the question there would be how quickly, how smoothly can everyone work without GPS and instead just use the European Galileo system and the Chinese Beidou system. The Russian GLONASS is not good enough, but Chinese and European versions of GPS, Beidou and Galileo, they can be used in a similar way. And it depends how far can we switch to those systems if we need to. And in such a massive war, though, we better hope that those systems don't get taken out either, which will be possible.
So perhaps as counter to that, if we're recognizing we have this just incredible risk above our heads, is it fair to say that we need strong ground-based systems to help manage or absorb the shocks of disruption to space services? Because there is the military targeting, but as you said, GPS also impacts everybody in their day-to-day life. So if we really want to counter that, do we just need broad resilience within the systems we have here to be able to manage that? And if we wanted to create these really strong ground-based systems to help protect ourselves against the risk that we face in the space domain, have we evolved to such a point that actually we now cannot develop systems capable of taking the burden of the systems that currently use assets within space? And that there's not a system we could design here on Earth that would be able to just step in place if we were to lose satellites, because it's just evolved too far.
That's a lot.
Sorry. I just thought, I was like, if I give you all the questions at once and then I'll let you run through it.
You think about those 14,000 satellites in Earth orbit now, and in the round, they are extensions of the global technological infrastructure that we all need and use in our one global system of politics, economics, finance, security, agriculture, energy, blah, blah, blah. They are extensions of them. What happens in space, Earth orbit especially, is not separate. So that entanglement is there. And if they weren't useful on Earth, they wouldn't be put there in the first place. Governments put them there for obvious reasons, really useful. They satisfy political and economic and military interests. So in terms of the terrestrial backups, I mean, there's stuff that you can do that can get by in a pinch, but it's not going to be as good. And there are some things that just aren't replaceable. So let's stick with navigation. I've been banging this drum for years, and finally the UK government recently announced that it was redeveloping something called eLORAN. And that is like a radio navigation beacon system. We used to have these back in the 20th century. So these were like radio direction beacons that you would have in ports, for example. And ships would come in and they'd be able to detect the radio waves from the shipping port and to do like a better navigation and guidance into particularly small ports and help manage traffic. And that was a local positioning system by radio. The trouble is that when GPS started becoming used for everything in the 80s and 90s, on a global level, with only small receivers needed on a ship to do it, these bulky local transmitters that consumed electricity, not just looked arcane, and GPS is always going to be there. So we're bringing back the new versions of eLORAN now. That's UK policy. So it's good to see that. So there are things you can do to have as backups and resilience. Galileo is, of course, the obvious one. So have a separate additional navigation space system ready up there if something happens to GPS, whether through hostility or just a snafu on the technical side with the Americans. So some things you can find backups for, they won't be as good, but you're still looking at inefficiencies. If you think that the Evergreen ship getting stuck in the Suez Canal was bad, imagine that happening at every port at the same time around the world. So it's about mitigating the disruption, responding more quickly, but you can't really end it. Where GPS and satellite services are really good, where it's really hard to replace them, is when you don't have ground infrastructure. So looking at offensive military operations, where you are moving into a territory, or you have an expeditionary force. Say now you want to send your forces to Greenland on short notice. You haven't got much infrastructure to work with. But you can have satellite communications, you'll have radio, you'll have broadband internet, you'll have navigation services, all without need for that much local infrastructure on the ground. So you can do it, makes your forces more mobile, lighter, more nimble, if you can use space services. Over the horizon targeting, that's another one. So knowing what the enemy is doing beyond the line of sight. Spy aircraft can only do so much because they can only go up to 50,000 feet. Satellites can see so much more, give you much more warning, and also are out of reach of those pesky air defense systems as well. So you have to go through other methods of disrupting satellites, so whether they're anti-satellite weapons or radio jammers, things like that. So So yeah, difficult patchwork of things to do, and you have to look at it on a service by service area in terms of, are there cheap, redundant measures we can put in just in case the worst happens? Like all infrastructure, we become path dependent on these systems. They develop a momentum of their own, whereas we're used to using them now. We can't imagine not using them. Like our societies here now are dependent on mechanized transport. People can't survive now if we lose use of cars and trains and planes. Every supply chains depend on them. So you get so far down a technological path that to change that in a substantial way is really expensive, really slow, and may just open up new vulnerabilities anyway. Because if you use any system and it becomes really good and really popular, there will always be ways to undermine it or use it for nefarious purposes that the designers may never have thought of, or there may be ways around it. So there's no silver bullet to this, but there are ways of mitigating the loss. But you have to accept that if the massive war happens, you're not going to have access to a lot of these services. And military planners are alert to that now, thankfully.
No, I think on this podcast and what we advocate for with a very much a multi-domain resiliency, we are all for having backup systems in place, but to always try to stop that first domino falling in a line. So what does space security, if we want to keep the space domain up and running and we want to keep those satellites in place, what does it mean in practice? And are there any steps you're seeing being taken by states, by institutions, or even by the commercial space industry, which is actively making space more resilient and a safer environment?
In the last 5 years, the UN has been quite busy with discussions on trying to get a resolution on identifying common threats and irresponsible behaviors in outer space. Just trying to get agreement and understanding on very basic key terms, problems. And this was actually led by the UK at the United Nations as well. So the Foreign Office has been very busy pushing that. And a couple of years ago, they were getting somewhere with the UN General Assembly on this, getting consensus and agreement. And then the Russians torpedoed the whole thing at the very end and stopped a common resolution from being formed. Now, you can easily dismiss this as just talking shop. And yeah, it's slow, it's frustrating. Glad that there are other people who have the stomach to do the difficult work here, and often massively frustrating because it's politics, it's diplomacy. And also I can learn from them what happened rather than having to listen to hours and hours of discussion myself all the time. Otherwise I get no work done. And especially when a lot of the language repeats stuff that has been said for the last 50 years. But
You just want the highlights reel.
yeah, and like, has anything new been said, or has there been any movement or progress somewhere? And I guess it's why I don't like watching cricket either, because you're 4 days in, you're like, has anything happened? Oh, no, not really. And 2020 cricket is better anyway. I can watch one of those. But you keep, so it's important then to keep talking. What's important from that process that we've had at the General Assembly, and it's been good to see, is that the process managed to bring in a lot of countries that weren't engaging in space security dialogues at all. So you already have the United Nations, the first and fourth committees, and the various committees on the peaceful uses of outer space, COPUOS, and the Committee on the Prevention of an Arms Race in Outer Space, PAROS. So you've COPUOS and PAROS, and they've been like log jammed for 40, 50 years. We could point you in the direction of good PhD on that, if you wish. Those traditional space diplomacy committees of the UN have been log jammed for so long. But what this UN General Assembly process led by the UK has done is bring in other countries, and especially developing states or countries that are new to formally doing things in space. So the Philippines, for example, has been really active in these negotiations, discussions, and it's bringing in these new to the field discussions and perspectives. And it's been a learning process for them and building consensus in terms of this isn't just about arms control, really. It's not just about the big powers. This is about governing that environment, making the environment safe, resilient, trying to minimize the risks of everyday problems or accidents from happening. And there's a lot of common ground to be had this, because the agreements and treaties that we have in space are very bare bones at the moment. The right principles, you could argue, but the details really need to be developed. But the language that comes from the UN General Assembly, if they get it into a resolution, could end up in a formal treaty at some point down the line. This is what happened with the Outer Space Treaty in 1967. A lot of the language of that treaty was agreed at the UN General Assembly in like 1964. So if things can be agreed at the General Assembly, that can become the basis for a bigger treaty down the line. Now, I know given current world events, it feels out of place to be talking in that way, but you need the professional diplomats and foreign officers or Ministry of Foreign Affairs to keep talking about these things so that when the political headwinds change, eventually they will, that language, these documents are ready to go so that when the next Chinese leader wants a nice win, a feel-good story on the world stage, I want a foreign policy win. Say, oh, well, actually, the Americans are quite happy with the language in this because we've been talking about it for like 15 years and have things ready to go for when the winds change. So in that case, that has been something where there's been interesting dialogue, nothing concrete yet, but the process is sort of has been ongoing, and I think it's been constructive for many different countries to get more involved in discussing these things rather than the usual suspects.
Yeah, no, very good to hear that there is still that effort taking place of let's have a dialogue together, especially given the world right now is not predisposed to dialogue. So do you think that the way that we make space this safe environment and we actually have progress being made in space security and so that all these bad things we mentioned at the start don't happen by satellites being taken out, does that rely more, in your opinion, on cooperation and collaboration and utilizing the UN and agencies like it rather than just what seems to be mood of the present day, which is to say, you shoot down my satellite and I'm going to go throw a missile at you?
I think it's both. And you can't have meaningful discussions if you ignore the other one. If you want to get round the diplomatic table, you cannot talk about and understand the role that deterrence and coercion plays in those relationships. And what happens in space is not separate from what happens on Earth. So very little that you can do at the UN if another country really is out to get you, going to come and get you. No, the only thing that stops that is you either defending yourself or being able to threaten the other side properly and convincingly, or you have another big partner that can do that for you as well. So that's where allies come in. So if somebody really is determined to threaten you and come for you, unfortunately, it has to be part of that solution because you can't reason with everyone. You know, if somebody wants to come for you, they're going to come for you unless you physically can stop them or threaten them not to, with good reasons. Appeals to morality doesn't work all the time, sadly. But yeah, if you want to build that better world and manage relationships so that over the long term, they don't get to the point where it really just becomes a language of threats and deterrence, which we're seeing more of from certain quarters now, you have to keep the diplomatic processes going. You have to build systems and rules and identify rules of the game that everyone agrees to play. And what we're seeing now is the United States deciding, I don't like the rules of the game I helped make anymore. And we're seeing the consequences of it now, the breakdown in trust. So I think you have to understand the role of diplomatic and norms and procedures, but as well as the reality of a world of threats and power as well. They exist in the same world, impact each other as well. And when one course of action is perhaps more feasible to maybe prevent war than the other. One of my favorite lines from my studies is when Napoleon Bonaparte said, Karl von Clausewitz said of Napoleon Bonaparte, he always claimed to be peace-loving. He would love to take our country unopposed. The aggressor is always peace-loving. And I think we're seeing that with Russia and Ukraine. They would love to have peace, and they would love to have Ukraine give up and take their country without another shot being fired. But then what does that peace mean afterwards? This is why the Ukrainians are resisting, and why I think is right that we in Europe are helping them to defend themselves, because the veiled language there in the diplomatic scene. But I think there's still good reasons to keep dialogue going all the same, because there are many other countries around the world that you can still get things done despite what's going on right now.
Yeah. So full disclosure to our viewers, we are recording this at the end of January. So it's being recorded weeks in advance of when it comes out to give time to the editors to do their magic. And so I suppose I'm asking you to make a prediction now to be heard in a few weeks. So we've got to put that caveat in. But you've just given this picture of, on the one hand, we're seeing such a breakdown in the world order and of our ability to have this diplomatic language. And then at the same time, that there are still positives and that the UN is actually doing what it should do. It's bringing people together, even if they are disagreeing like there's no tomorrow, which is honestly, for anybody who doesn't study international relations, the fact that you can get states to just talk to each other sometimes is really good. So do you have is it leaning towards a positive or is it leaning toward a more negative view for where we're going in regards to the governance of space, the security of space, developments happening therein?
Yeah, given the time we are recording this, it's very difficult to be optimistic for the near future. I think what we're dealing with, and again, this is where this is about world order in general and power politics in general, which spills into space. So this is not space specific. It is that decline of the United States global power. So we're seeing the United States become less trustworthy. The agreements that countries hammer out, with the Trump administration in particular, are increasingly worthless. So we're recording on the day that Donald Trump has called the British really stupid for the Diego Garcia deal. Like, actually use the word stupid, I think, like calling it a sheer stupidity or something like that. But that was after the Starmer and Trump governments agreed to it last year together, and where Britain spent an inconsiderable sum of money on it to ensure the agreement of the Mauritius government and the lease then, so that the Americans could still use it for another century. And only to have this now. And this is just the latest in a long line of agreements that Trump himself has agreed to now reneged on, let alone agreements that prior administrations and Congresses have agreed to. So what we're dealing with there is one of the biggest architects of that post-1945 United Nations system just moving away from it. And a few weeks ago, we had a long list of institutions in the United Nations and also adjacent to the United Nations that the United States is stopping all funding and also withdrawing its membership from, including bodies like the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the most authoritative international body on the science of climate change. Who knows exactly where this is going to end up? And in terms of norms and in terms of then specifically the space, what we're looking at really is trying to figure out, can we at least agree on common rules, language, ways of doing things, which may also then support trade and visa agreements, because that's where the prize is really. If the EU and Mercosur sign that free trade agreement, so that's a huge thing. By the time this gets put out, there may be a European-India agreement as well. And space would be part of that larger rest of the world trying to maybe hammer out agreements. We've had the Canada-China trade agreements recently as well. And we're reaching a position where, at least if you have an agreement with China and you have the same understanding of the text, you can predict the Chinese government's behavior relative to this agreement. And that is very dangerous for the United States in terms of its role as a world power and the economic center of the world, which may not be the case for much longer. Who knows?
So to round off the episode, and I think just to bring back that focus on space, even though I do very much support a good discussion on international relations and where the world is going and the world order. On this podcast, although we cover national security, we don't want it to be a doom and gloom and a doomerist style podcast. So we like to end our episodes by asking our guests for two things. And the first is, it's something in this conversation has sparked someone's interest. What would you recommend they read or listen to or explore independently to learn more? And secondly, for anyone listening who has an idea about anything said today that they think could help, or think that heard this and they are thinking maybe they want to work in the space domain, can you offer some career advice or guidance? And that's for anyone from young people who are still in school, so young people like myself who are students, or it could be for people who have already had a career and are thinking of a career change.
Yeah. So in terms of further reading, naturally, I will suggest my own work.
Let's go with it. We're all for self-promotion on this podcast.
So yeah, my last book was called Original Sin: Power, Technology, and War in Outer Space, and is published by Hearst Publishers here in the UK and also distributed in Europe. If you're listening globally, you can get it with Oxford University Press around the world. And I think there's a Mandarin edition coming out later this year as well. But the English edition is also coming in paperback this year as well. So you'll have me at even greater value. So that book is really an international political history of the space age. So it's designed to introduce people to the politics and military aspects of outer space from otherwise interested people in international affairs. That would be a great place to start. If you're interested in more Cold War history stuff, and I know Donald Trump keeps talking about the Golden Dome at the moment, which is basically a rehash of Ronald Reagan's Star Wars or Strategic Defense Initiative. For some reason, everybody's doing remakes these days. So I guess why not do that for space policy as well? And as you would imagine, the modern one is really terrible as well. But
I've heard that.
But if you're interested in a more Cold War dimension, Star Wars program with Reagan, Aaron Bateman's Weapons in Space, The Rise and Fall of the Strategic Defense Initiative, that's a very good book as well. And that's probably like Cold War international space history there as well. So those two books. Then there's also a book by Alice Gorman down in Australia called Dr. Space Junk versus the Universe. That's a really fun book to read. And it's basically a space archaeologist sort of travels in researching the politics and history of outer space through archaeology. So those are sort of the top three then come to mind in terms of just things to get started. And I think Dr. Space Junk is the most accessible of them all. She's written for a really wide audience with that book. So go for Alice Gorman's Dr. Space Junk versus the Universe. In terms of careers, thinking it's difficult really, as it's been so long since I've really been involved in the job market. So I have no idea what the landscape is like between sort of think tank and policy work, civil service. But generally, though, ignore people who tell you if something is passé or anachronistic, especially in the world of politics and international relations, because the big ideas don't change that much. And that also means historians are still very good, very useful, sought after in this line of work, because you find the big ideas and problems and the details change, but the themes often stay the same, for better and worse. So don't get people telling you, well, this is what you need to know about this subject, and this is how it's done, or people aren't interested in this subject anymore. Keep reading it, keep doing it, and try to forge your own path if you can. But also be wary of institutional power as well. Actually pay attention to what someone's saying. Don't just take, or because they publish at an institution, it must be particularly insightful. There's a lot of institutions that are just putting stuff out there, especially now in the age of LLMs and automated language processors. We have to be even more critical of what is this person saying? What are they saying that's new or particularly insightful? Do you agree with it or not? Because it's a very competitive landscape out there, and having to try to go beyond the policy language of the day. Don't just repeat slogans.
Would you be brave enough to name a few institutions? No. Okay. Right. No worries then. Thank you very much for joining us. It's actually been really, really interesting, not just to get to make for other people, but I didn't know that about Uber Eats and Tinder and missile systems all needing the same bit of kit. So
it's all GPS signals.
Yeah, thank you so much for coming on. I really enjoyed getting to talk with you today. It's been
thanks
really
for the great discussion.
As always, all of the links that Bleddyn has mentioned will be linked in the description. For now, that's everything from me at Resilient State this week. We'll be back in 2 weeks on March the 2nd to talk about the role of war photographers, war reporting, and the changes that we are seeing in that media and domain with the rise of apps such as TikTok and Instagram. Until then, that's it from me. As always, you can find us on Instagram, TikTok, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Substack, X, and a whole lot of other places.